Hello, everybody. And there's loads of you here. There's a bunch of people here. And it's a real pleasure to welcome everyone to this second home of the Celsius Festival, which is the headquarters of the Telefónica Foundation in Madrid, one of our main sponsors, without whom this festival would be impossible, and without whom we wouldn't be able to have Brandon Sanderson in Spain today, in Madrid and Avilés. And so the first thing I'd like you to do is to give a big round of applause to Espacio Telefónica for enabling us to bring Brandon here. And the second thing I wanted to say, which is not as pleasant, is that as soon as the talk ends, we need to rush off. We really need to leave because we have a flight to Avilés tonight, and the talk's going to go on till around 8. So please do not ask him to sign anything when we finish, because unfortunately we have to catch that flight. And so we're going to have to leave straight away after we finish the talk here. And the third thing I wanted to say is, if you're going to tweet, remember to use the hashtag Espacio Sanderson, please. And the fourth thing I want to say is that I'm just going to leave you with it, because you're here to listen to Brandon and to listen to the three wonderful presenters that we have for him today. Well, at least 2.5, because the first is, of course, very well known to us, Arturo Fernández Campos, or Arturo Parroquia. And since he can't reply now, I'll just say now that it's a great pleasure to have him with us today. He's a guy that has a great sense of humor, but don't let him distract you with that sense of humor, because under that smile, there's a very great intelligence and tremendous knowledge of literature and fiction. So let's give him a big welcome. Thank you. Thank you very much. And of course, we're talking about expertise, and there are many people in Spain or even in the world who know more about Brandon Sanderson's work than the people who run the cosmere.es website. And it's a pleasure to have one of them with us tonight. She has reviewed the translations into Spanish of Brandon's work. She reviews everything, all the news to do with Brandon, so she had to be here. Big round of applause for Tamara Elea, who's joining us tonight as well. And of course, readers are everywhere. It doesn't matter whether you're a completely anonymous person in the street or one of the best known chefs in this country. If you love reading, you love reading. And if you're a huge fan and a great speaker like Alberto Chicote, you wouldn't miss a chance to have him here with Brandon. And so big round of applause also for Alberto Chicote. And I'm going to leave you with them. There will be a Q&A towards the end. There will be translation, so just enjoy yourselves. I guess we're missing somebody, but I'm going to let them introduce him. Okay, good evening. Good evening. Diego, of course, will be translating for us. Welcome, everybody, to the Telefónica Foundation. Welcome to everybody who's sitting here, but also everyone who's following the webcast. And we're here, gathered tonight to bring together, that's sounding very much like a wedding, in holy matrimony. Now you better rewind, that's just not sounding right. Well, we have a bunch of the faithful here to meet with the creator of worlds. So I think you had to be a bit solemn. You don't think that was the right sort of tone? Well, you know, you were introduced as someone who was tremendously bright and knowledgeable, but you haven't started off very well. Yeah, you're right. Okay, so today we're very fortunate. We have Brandon Sanderson with us, and it's something that I'm sure is making all of us tremendously happy because we've spent so many hours with his work, and now we have a chance to meet him in person. And of course, we're also all thinking about those people out there on the web who are not as fortunate as we are, who haven't yet started reading the amazing books of Brandon Sanderson. So let's think about all that while we have this talk. Tamara, yeah, that's me. Okay, you, of course, wonderful person, but perhaps not quite sane. What happened to you to turn Brandon Sanderson into your profession, your life's work? And she's even in uniform. Well, I don't know. A lot of things happened. One day, I went into a bookshop and I saw a book which looked really cool. It had a really nice cover. And my favorite writer then, one of my favorite writers now, was Orson Scott Card. And he was reviewing a book and said it was the most beautiful fantasy book he'd read in years. And I had no idea who the author was. It was Brandon Sanderson, but I didn't know who that was. And I bought the book and took it home and loved it. And next thing I remember, I read Mistborn. And I went to a bookstore that I really love in Barcelona, which is called, can I say it? Yes. Yes, and so a colleague, of course you can say the name of the bookstore. It's one of the biggest fantasy and science fiction libraries bookstores in Spain. I've actually got the name tattooed on my butt. Right, well, you haven't shown me that. And anyway, I went to that bookstore and I asked one of the guys there, I said, do you have anything else by this guy? And they had just published that anthology set, and I took it home and I said, well, just whatever this guy publishes, just put one aside for me. I didn't care, even shopping lists, whatever. Anything he publishes, I want to read. And I thought it was wonderful. And Alberto Chicote, of course, you're familiar with, I think. And you know he's a fascinating character. We're all used to seeing him on TV, but he is an absolute geek. And well, Tamara is obsessed, but Alberto is probably even worse. It's nice to be called obsessive here in front of everybody, but there's something you don't know about him, and that is he's really persistent. And so one day he started to say to me, you have to read Brandon Sanderson, you have to read Brandon Sanderson. And just to get him to stop, I probably will do everything, even tattooing things on my butt. I didn't say that. I said, you have to read Brandon Sanderson, and also I gave him the books, which is not at all the same as saying go out and buy them. It's, here's the books. Yeah, if you don't pay attention to him, then he gives you the book. And then I'm going to sit here for a while until you read it. So he was my mentor, I suppose, in introducing me to Brandon Sanderson's world. And so, Alberto, what happens when you read Sanderson and suddenly you get obsessed? Well, as I wrote in the introduction to... I remember, well, it was a favor. Antonio Sauro, the son of Carlos Sauro, we were in Montreal presenting a film, and he was looking for, well, when it wasn't published at the same time in Spanish and English, he was, I think, looking for the second part, or the second Mistborn book, or the third, maybe even, the Hero of the Ages, and he said, Alberto, haven't you read this? It sounded like I was an idiot if I hadn't read it, because of course we talked about books so many times, and he reads incredible speed, and I wish I knew how he manages to read so fast. But I also want to know how Brandon can write so fast. But he said to me, well, if you haven't ever read this, you're an idiot. That's how he said it, friendly like. And so he gave me Mistborn that same day in English. And I, of course, rather adventurous, and I can sort of read English, but not that well. I started trying to read it, and I read maybe 60 pages or so, and then I got to Spain and I thought, I better buy this in Spanish. And then they'll be probably a lot easier to follow. And so I read Mistborn, the first book, and then Elandris, and then, well, it was, like sort of just revelation. I just wanted to read anything and everything that he'd ever published because I love it all. And I was just picturing Diego translating this right now. And Brandon was saying, oh, that bastard. Well, actually, earlier I said that I had a really nice story to share, which is that a good part of that introduction to Brandon Sanderson's work, when I hadn't read anything and wanted to read it all at once, was the time when I would leave the restaurant in the evening, and while I was waiting for my wife, Imma, who's sitting here, who actually got out of work 2 hours later, in the car, I just sat there and devoured Brandon's books. And I was never sure whether I wanted her to get there or to be late, because I was having such a great time with the reading. And I have to tell you that on January 5th, I was, in the Madrid parade and the Christmas parade, and I was really looking forward to, and I usually love that. I loved playing one of the Three Kings, but I couldn't wait for the parade to be over because I had 50 pages left of The Hero of Ages, and I just couldn't wait for the parade to be over because I wanted to go home. My wife was working that night, and I wanted to go home to sit in a cafeteria nearby, high living indeed, to read the remaining 50 pages of the book because I just couldn't wait. Well, I know that Inma has sometimes ended up knocking on the car window and waiting for Alberto to open the door so after he finished the chapter, and took her home. Okay, so that was really fun. Didn't miss anybody in this nice chat. No, actually, the time has come. We wanted to make a quick introduction just to share our love for his work. I'm sure a lot of you have stories you could share about how you started reading Brandon's work, but now the time has come to welcome the true hero of today's chat. Everyone here, everyone following us on the webcast. It's great world builder, Brandon Sanderson.
Hey.
Hey guys, how you doing? Thanks for that introduction.
¿Te das cuenta, Brandon, de que aquí hay un montón de gente que ha leído?
You must have realized there's a bunch of people here who've read all your books or fascinated with your stories in Spain, which is, such a small, faraway place. But you knew Spain existed, right? For some particular reason, I think.
I've lived in Spain for a little while, and Spain was the first place I was invited to visit as an author. Right after she and I got married, I got an email from Miguel, who was then the publisher of the Spanish editions, and he had said, "Hey, do you want to come to Spain?" And I knew this was going to look really good with my new wife, so I went to her and said, "Hey, do you want a free trip to Spain?" And she's like, "What?" I'm like, "Hey, you married an author. There are perks." And it was I acted like it happened all the time, but it was the first time it ever happened. And so we came to Barcelona back in 2008, I think it was, like right at the beginning of my career. And ever since then, we found every excuse we can take to get back to Spain.
Okay. Bueno, pues vamos a empezar a hablar.
Okay, well, let's start talking about Brandon Sanderson's work. And you, of course, are the great experts, but I'm not sure whether they use the same expression in English. Could we talk about the elephant in the room straight away, which is, what do you mean, elephant? Arturo, what do you mean? I'm not sure whether they use that expression in English, but an elephant in the room. Well, there's a question everyone wants to ask, and they were already thinking about it even before Brandon came in, which is, how do you manage to write so much and of such quality, especially? So let's ask that straight away, just to break the ice and get things moving.
I have a big advantage writing when I do, and that is that some of my contemporaries make me look really good. If I were writing back during the silver age of science fiction, when Asimov and people were all writing their books, I would have been slow by comparison back then. I'm not really actually writing-wise, if you look at it, I'm not particularly fast. Some of these people who write, self-publish on YouTube, they're releasing a book a month. And back in the days, that's what a lot of the early writers would do. I'm just very methodical. I write every day. I'm very consistent. The other big advantage I have is that when I started writing, I was really bad at it. And this might not sound like an advantage, but it really was, because I had no idea what I was doing. I discovered fantasy novels kind of late. I was 14 when I read my first one, and I just fell in love with the genre. I kind of found myself in these books, and I wanted to become a writer, but I had not been a particularly good student, and I was not a good reader, and so it took me a while. I wrote 13 novels, mostly starting when I was in my young 20s until 30, and I was really, really bad at it. Well, this is an advantage over some of my contemporaries who are very, very, very talented and write brilliant books from the get-go. I had to really learn how to write, and I built really good habits. So when I sold Mistborn, or I sold Elantris, I had written 13 novels, and I knew how to fail at writing a novel and how to succeed. And I still fail sometimes, but these two things, having worked a long time, I worked a graveyard shift at a hotel. That's how I taught myself to write. I was going to school full-time and working full-time. The only way I could write was those precious moments at night after I finished my homework, after I checked in everyone in the hotel. I'd spend 4 or 5 hours working on books every night on the hotel front desk computer. I didn't have my own laptop or anything, so I used the old floppy disks in that same computer they would check everyone in at. And I really learned my process. And so when I sold, I hit the ground running, right? I was very eager, and I'd written a lot, and so it's a mix of these two things. I'm not really as fast as I seem. I just, that old adage that if you run into a bear, you don't have to be faster than the bear, you just have to be faster than the person who's with you. Well, as long as I stay faster than some of my contemporaries who are perhaps a little slower of writers, then I look like a speed demon.
Claro, yo me pregunto.
But I was wondering if, after having written those 13 novels before you got Elantris published, if everybody was telling you, publishers, oh, this is awful, this is horrible, I wonder whether you've actually gone back and reread those novels and whether you agree with those opinions that you got, that they were awful.
Still awful, but the early ones. The late ones are not as awful. Elantris was one of those, right? Book number 6.
No tan malas.
And I have another one in there called White Sand that we revised and released as a graphic novel. And rereading through it, I'm like, wow, I was getting okay, right? They aren't all terrible. They just got the early ones in particular. The first 5 are just they're absolute trash. But that's okay.
Horrorosas.
Horrendous.
Is trying to break in. What I kept getting told was, number 1, your books are too long. That's what the publishers kept telling me. And number 2, they kept saying, can you write more like George Martin? Right? Except short, but he's long.
Demasiado largas y terminas.
Too long, and you ended up writing a 10-book series with 1,400 pages each.
What they were really looking for was Joe Abercrombie, right? All the publishers then were looking for people like Joe, and Joe's a great writer. But I was not, and am not, Joe Abercrombie. But I tried to be Joe Abercrombie. I tried like books, I said that I wrote 13. Books 11 and 12 are really bad. And you would think those would be among my best, but after I kept getting rejected with Elantris and Dragonsteel and White Sand, these were 6, 7, and 8. And around that time, I kept getting these rejections. I'm like, well, people want to read this dark, gritty stuff. Let me try writing it. And so books 11 and 12 of mine were really me trying to be George R. R. Martin, but short. Because that's what they wanted. They wanted George R. R. Martin, but short. And let me tell you, trying to be someone you're not is not a great recipe for success. Certainly you can learn from other people, right? And I often say, imitating someone's style actually is just fine as a writer. But my heart wasn't in it. And those books were really bad. I sent them to an agent at the time that eventually became my agent, who I've been working with. And he said, wow, these feel like really big steps backward for you. What happened? I thought you were almost there. And it was me kind of trying to chase the market. And after these failed, and I thought, okay, people don't want what I want to write. It's too long. And they said the world building's too extensive. They wanted things like George's, where the world building's minimal. That was what was really hot back then. They wanted low magic. They wanted short. They wanted gritty. And I'm like, well, they don't want to read what I want to write. But when I try to write what they want to read, I just fail. And that I kind of had a very dark moment in my career after book 12 where I'm like, what am I doing? Right? How many people, how long do you have to write, before you get the hint? 12 novels? I mean, come on. And I thought a lot about it, and I thought, well, why am I doing this? And I kind of came to the conclusion that I just loved it, right? And this is a very important moment for me to kind of realize, hey, if I turn 90 and I've written 100 unpublished novels, but I loved every minute of it, am I a failure? I think this is an important realization to have, because the truth is not everybody can be a professional writer who wants to write. Not everyone who enjoys cooking can be a professional chef. We can't always, in life we like to say, chase your dreams, you can do it all. But the truth is, if I wanted to go play football for Barcelona right now at age 44, being maybe not in the best shape, you know what? I can't do that. Right? I can't, if that were my dream, that's not going to happen. But if I wanted to go play football and enjoy it and learn how to do it, I could get better. I could get good for who I am. And I kind of realized, as a writer, if I never make it professionally, but I love doing it, and this is who I am, then I just need to keep going. I need to keep writing.
Pero tú pretendías.
But you wanted to make a living out of it.
Absolutely did. I absolutely did. But I had that moment where and that's when I said, what, they tell me the books are too short or too long. I'm going to write one that's twice as long. They tell me there's too much magic in my books. I'm going to put so much stuff, so much magic in this book. I'm going to do all the things they tell me not to do. I'm just going to write a book for myself. And book number 13 was called The Way of Kings. And it is, when I finished it, it wasn't ready yet. But it was the best experience I'd ever had writing up until that point. And as I finished The Way of Kings, that's when a phone call came from an editor wanting to buy Elantris. And I've been super lucky that I go on. I'm really happy I get to make a living at this, right? I don't just make a living, I make a good living, right? But I'm glad I had that moment before where I made the decision, you know what, I'm going to do this no matter what. I'm going to keep writing. They're going to have to find me dead at my keyboard someday. That face has fallen on the keyboard, and I'm 105. Let's just be optimistic. And I've written, the letter D for 200 pages, which right now, my publisher would still want to publish. But, I want to be that person that I just keep writing up into the day, because it's about the stories for me. And I've been very lucky, but at the same time, that was kind of the road that took me to writing these super long, epic fantasies. And this is how I know that this is the stories I really want to tell, because it's the one I wrote when I thought no one would ever publish me.
A mí es que, por ejemplo, eso me resulta fascinante,
Como veis,
Well, as you can see, Brandon is hard to interview. He's, monosyllabic. It's hard to get a word out of him, but we'll do our best. I've learned so much, and we've only just started this chat. I've already learned so much from what he's told us. Even if you're really bad, just keep trying, keep trying. He's really sorted out my sex life for me. And I think the time has come, perhaps, to give Tamara the floor. Well, thank you. Thank you, I think, after that intro. I was just going to say that one of the things that I find fascinating is the fact that, well, first of all, perseverance, of course, because a lot of people don't ever get where they want to get to because they throw in the towel and maybe they were just about to make it. And the second thing that I find fascinating is that there's always another way. For example, you wanted to write fantasy, saga, in a literary universe, but obviously the publisher must have thought it was crazy to try that right now. But it's about finding the way in, finding a sort of different route, and leaving all these trail of, I don't know, clues pointing at where you really wanted to go. I'm thinking, well, I have a plan B. You haven't seen it yet, but I have this plan B, which is going to materialize gradually. And I think the greatest thing is for us to have been able to discover it too. Yes, it's clear, and it's another elephant in the room. We were saying this to Alberto at the beginning, and it's another one of those questions which we would like you to answer. Was it all in your head from the start, all of it, or do you create it or come up with it as you go? Well, this might be different in the US. But here we talk about what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? And when I'm reading Sanderson's books, I always wonder what came first. A series of characters and stories who were out there and which were then enveloped in this universe, cosmere. How do you say it? Cosmere, right. Okay, that's clear. All right. Of course, we never knew how to say it properly, of course. But anyway, cosmere. Okay, we've got it. And so what came first? Cosmere or the egg or the chicken? Because how did things actually work? This is, I guess, a clearer question. Brandon. I'm saying Brandon as if we were, friends forever. But so did you first write the story and then decided to position it within this bigger universe? Or did you first think of this bigger world and then gradually seeded it with stories which then readers would discover as a world beyond what was in the initial stories?
It's a little of everything, actually. I remember reading Asimov when I was young. And after I got into science fiction, I read Foundation, which is one of the great science fiction works of all time. And I read that, and I read the robots stories. And then I eventually had that realization that he was combining the two together. And it was incredible to me, right? And Michael Moorcock had done some of this with combining his books together, and Stephen King had done some of this, and it really inspired me. And I thought it felt like a lot of these writers had been doing all of this and then come up with these ideas and kind of put them together after. And I thought the way I can learn from them is I can learn how cool this is and kind of start it from the get-go. So I always wanted to do some big interconnected thing. This also grew out of partially necessity. When I was trying to break in with those 13 books, one of the things I had realized is that if I wrote 13 books in a series, I could never try to sell book 13. I could only market book 1, right? Mm-hmm. No publisher wants to see book 3 in a series after they rejected book 1. And so of those 13 books, almost all of them exclusively were new books with new magic systems and new worlds. And so I got very used to developing a new world, and I started to connect in my head how these all would work together. It was kind of my way of, and in English we say, have your cake and eat it too, right? What it meant was I could have these standalone books that would introduce me to a new audience, but also it wouldn't be intimidating, right? If you get a standalone or a trilogy, it's not as intimidating. As a new writer, I was looking at authors publishing and seeing how skeptical I got when book 1 of like a 10-book series got released by a brand new author I'd never heard of, I was really skeptical they could pull it off. I wanted to read a standalone by them or a trilogy by them first to make sure that it's worth jumping into something that big. And so it was partially necessity of publication. Everything had to be new. Partially this idea that when I publish, I want to be doing lots of standalones and trilogies. But I also fell in love with fantasy in part because of the works of Robert Jordan and Anne McCaffrey, who wrote these big epics, these large interconnected stories. And that's what I'd always wanted to do. And so I started creating a hidden epic. You ask if it was all there from the beginning. Fortunately, it didn't have to be because I spent 10 years not being published. And this, again, is one of the biggest advantages I have. The first book I wrote to kind of be in the Cosmere was Elantris, and I really had no idea what it was then. My first 5 books were all just very different genres. I wrote an epic fantasy, I wrote a comedy, I wrote a space opera, I wrote a cyberpunk. I just wanted to explore and see where I really want to be. And at the end, I'm like, you know what? Epic fantasy is what I love. It's what I suspected. So Elantris was the first one I wrote kind of knowing I'm going to make epic fantasy my thing. But I really didn't have the whole Cosmere in my head. I just knew I wanted to do something. And so I started putting in these seeds, the pool, the references to Hoyd and all of this stuff. And I wrote over these years, I wrote a book called Dragonsteel, which was Hoyd's backstory, and I wrote all this stuff. And then when I finally sold Elantris, I said, wow, you know what? I can actually do what I wanted to do. Because I have all this backstory that I've now spent years with books that are unpublished, I can take that all as canon in my head, and I can take Mistborn and write Elantris, and I can start building it from scratch the way I really want it to be. So it's almost like, you know, how the Marvel Cinematic Universe got to take the Marvel stories that were best and turn them into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Well, I had these 13 books that I could take the best ideas from and the best magic systems. For instance, Mistborn stole the magic system from another book that I had written before that had mostly worked and needed a few tweaks but had a terrible plot. Meanwhile, I had written another story where the idea was that the hero who is prophesied to save everyone had failed. Well, that was a great seed of an idea, and I rammed those two together, and I made Mistborn in a way that worked. And so I was able to plumb and steal from old, bad Brandon Sanderson and turn them into the good, new, published Brandon Sanderson. And it looks like, you know, it all came out of nowhere, but I had all of these resources that I'd worked on over those years. So I really hit the ground running. My editor says he's never seen an author hit the ground running as fast as I did. But again, I had all of this ready, and I was ready to go. And people would read Elantris and then read Mistborn when I published it and say, wow, this guy got so much better in just one book, not knowing that I'd written, you know, Elantris in 1998 and I'd written Mistborn in 2004, right? And so I had just 6 years of growth in between. So it really looked like I no sophomore slump. It really looked like I suddenly learned a whole bunch. But I really do credit those years just writing by myself, not having to worry about publishing, and just exploring being a writer as part of what has made me able to do what I've done.
Cuando nombras a...
When you mention the hero, and in your books, I get the impression at least that you really avoid the whole Campbellian sort of hero canon where, it seems as if every fantasy writer had to follow reverently, you know, step by step from the time the sword's handed over and so on. But in your books, however, you really avoid that whole canon. You follow a completely different approach. Is that deliberate? Is that something you want to break away from, that tradition? Or it just so happens that you just go a different way and you're not really worried about breaking away from that? Well, and I would actually add to your question do fantasy readers have to be babied along and told the same story over and over, and you, because you're a rebel, are trying to convince them that there are other ways to tell stories?
This is a very astute question. And as a reader in the late 90s, I found I was getting a bit bored with the fantasy genre. And
I thought, oh no, I've lost my love of something that I used to truly love. But I realized one of the things I loved about fantasy was it took me to a new place, a new time. It showed me something brand new. That was very fresh. And I realized that one of the reasons I was feeling this way was not that the genre was wrong, but I kept kind of getting given the same stories. And I don't blame the authors for this. I look back at kind of the history of epic fantasy, and it did start with Tolkien, right? And I feel like Tolkien was ahead of his time. He wrote something no one had ever seen before, which was a secondary world fantasy, and he did it really well. And the genre basically he did it really well, and then he died on us, right? And so the genre just basically spent all the 70s and 80s dealing with that, like, wow, this beautiful, amazing thing happened. We don't know really where it came from. Let's explore this. And you get some really fantastic writers like Stephen Donaldson. Robert Jordan's another one that really took the Tolkien sort of idea and expanded it and played with it and tried a whole bunch of different things. It did some brilliant stories. But then the 90s hit, and I really feel like people had started to expect, oh, this is what fantasy must be. Where if you look back at the 60s and the 50s when Tolkien was writing, science fiction fantasy, there wasn't even a hard line between it. Everybody was exploring all different places. It was just that this thing he wrote was so good and so amazing and so different that it left echoes through the genre for many years. But what that ends up happening is we start getting this feeling of, does every fantasy have to be medieval England with a hero's quest and a long journey? Are there no other stories to tell? And I think that it's fantasy. It should be the most imaginative genre out there. And so the fact that we got kind of trapped in this, again, I don't blame the authors. As a genre as a whole, we kind of had to realize, wait a minute, we can do other things. And George, I think, was part of what shook us all out of that, right? He released Game of Thrones in 95, I believe it was, kind of at the height of people being like, these starting to feel like a rut. And then he released something that took a lot of the more old heroic fantasy tradition and mashed it up with the epic fantasy tradition and created something along with some actual medievalism and things like this. And people are like, wow, we can do other things with fantasy. And I think that opened the door for a lot of us who, as writers at that time, were starting to feel like, let's do something different. And the thing I had always wanted to do is I wanted worlds that felt fantastical. I wanted worlds that didn't just feel like another kind of carbon copy of a Tolkien-esque medieval England. And the other thing I wanted to do is, since I had this whole history of people of reading fantasy, I wanted to play against it. This is not out of dislike for what people like Tolkien or Robert Jordan or even Terry Brooks did. This is just me saying, that's been covered. Robert Jordan did this really well. What else is there to do? Well, I can play with the idea that you expect it to play out a certain way. And that was the foundation of where Mistborn came from, was me building on this idea that you have certain expectations of a hero's journey. And if I make the hero look a lot different, you won't spot that hero. Even as they're going through their own journey, which is different from the kind of traditional hero's journey. Stormlight, I went a different direction. Stormlight is not me trying to do a modernist take on the fantasy genre. Stormlight is me just saying, this is what I think is the model for how I want to do a fantasy book. Very fantastical world. Very different laws of physics. You walk into this world and things just don't even look the same, but the people are the same. And that's very important to me. I feel like human beings, one of the things that fantasy does is it shows us that human beings, regardless of culture, regardless of race, regardless of religion, there are certain fundamental things that make us human that are relatable. And it doesn't matter how different that is, you can understand these people. And I think it brings us together in some ways. And I think that's very important for fantasy the type I want to write, is I think that it does that kind of work. That's what fantasy did for me as a young man reading, is it I'm going off on a tangent, I'm sorry. But the book that made me a reader...
Yo le preguntaba por lo del héroe.
I was asking about the hero tradition.
Ve por donde quieras. Yeah.
Go anywhere you like. Ramble on.
The book that got me into fantasy is Dragon's Bane by Barbara Hambley. Now, if you haven't read this book, it's a little lesser known book. It's fantastic, but it is about a middle-aged woman going through a midlife crisis. that is the story. It's about a woman who's been told by her mentor that she could be the best magic user he's ever met. She's got raw natural talent. She just needs to dedicate herself to it. But she also is dividing her time with her family. And it's kind of the, what do I give to my family? What do I give to my work, right? Now, this shouldn't have worked for a 14-year-old boy, right? What you normally give to a 14-year-old boy is, 14-year-old boy goes on an adventure, right? That's what the books say you should give. But people had been giving me all of these books about teenage boys who had pet dogs and the dogs died, right? That kind of story. And I was not a reader, and they kept trying to get me to read by giving me these because they thought, oh, he'll want to read about a 14-year-old boy. I knew what it was like to be a 14-year-old boy. It kind of sucked, right? That age. And giving me a book about someone who was very different from me, yet whose conflict was very interesting and relatable, was what did it for me, right? It's the magic, it's the dragons, but it's also different people. And, you know, my mother at the time had given up a very prestigious scholarship because she wanted to have a family. She was first in her class in accounting in a year where she was the only woman in most of her accounting classes. And she was offered a very big scholarship and she turned it down. She wanted to have me. And she put off her career while I was young. And she eventually went back and became a fantastic accountant. But as a kid growing up, I'd always thought, well, of course she did that. I'm awesome. Why wouldn't you do this? But I'm reading this book about this woman, and I'm like, ditch your family, woman. You could be a wizard, right? Stop. Those kids are annoying. And I'm reading this book, and I'm like, wait a minute. This is like my mom. Somehow I'm reading a fantasy adventure book about slaying a dragon, and I understand my mother better. There is something really, really magical, pun intended, about this book. And that is what drove me to want to become a writer. And I think as long as we're approaching that, you know, I think people could still do the Campbellian monomyth really well. I think there's lots of places for other stories that explore this. But I don't think fantasy has to be that. And I think that's the problem we had for many years. When fantasy is great, it's not just farm boys going on quests. It is farm boys going on quests in some books, yes, but it's also middle-aged women having midlife crises, deciding between their career and their family, and also giving you dragons. So, you know, that's what makes this genre awesome.
Es que en ese sentido, perdona.
Déjame que le haga un inciso.
Let me say something. In my house, there's a lot of books. My mother is an avid reader. She reads even more than I do. Of course, she's got a lot more free time, and she does read all sorts of books, and I give her fantasy books to read too. And she says, no, Alberto, I don't like reading about swords and dragons. And one day I lent Elantris to her and said, you've got to read this. And she said, oh, this I will read, because this is entirely different. And of course, my mom doesn't really feel that much of a bond with Abercrombie. When blood splashes faces, she doesn't enjoy it that much. She's 80, you know, but she loved Elantris, and she loved Mistborn, because I think she does see what fantasy is really about, what you're saying, about seeing new worlds, new places to explore, new stories to discover beyond the sort of medieval sword fighting. Yeah, not so many heroes and more people, no, more humans. I think that's really the difference between the sort of fantasy we had become accustomed to reading, some of which was fantastic and wonderful, of course, but getting a bit repetitive, but not so used to reading about people. And as Brandon was saying, people that my mom could identify with, or my cousin, or whomever. And by the way, why does your mom go to your house and take books instead of bringing you samples of her cooking? It's just, no, she does bring me food, and then I lend her books in exchange. And Tamara, I know that, of course, you know so much about Brandon Sanderson's work, and perhaps even more than Brandon himself. No, I doubt that. But I was thinking about the humanity of the characters. Something that's often said, for example, with the Way of the Kings, for example, is how the characters really reach the readers, because, or this special way in which they are able to overcome all kinds of odds and grow. And I remember Paige Best, who wrote that fantastic article about the relationship between, overcoming with one's limitations. And I thought it was fascinating. I think it's really inspiring, and also how those characters are built to connect with the reader because they're very different to other types of heroes, which are perhaps more of a stereotype.
It's very interesting. I teach a university course on writing science fiction and fantasy, and I talk a lot about this idea that fantasy is defined by its setting, right? What makes something be a fantasy book is generally setting aspects, the world, the magic. And I'm known for my magic systems, but there's a bit of a fallacy in that. That might make people assume that to write great fantasy, the best thing you need to be is a world builder. And I certainly don't think it hurts, but if you divide a book really into three things, you've got your plot, your setting, and your character. A book that has great characters but a weak setting is still generally a great book, right? Particularly if it's got a good plot as well. A book that has a fantastic setting but weak characters, still generally a bad book, right? Now, there are things we can say, like, for instance, if the setting gets too repetitive, the plot gets too repetitive, sometimes it doesn't matter. If your characters are great, you might still get bored. And we've been talking about that. But in a lot of ways, the setting is the least important of the three. If you can't tell a story about great characters and make people care about them, then the reader won't care about the setting. It's the same thing for action sequences, right? We're used to the fact that in a film, a really great action sequence, we don't have to care. We can watch a Jackie Chan fight scene, and at least me, I will just watch him kick people for a half hour, right? And I don't have to know much about these people. I can just be like, Jackie, that was awesome. How did you do that, right? But in a book, it doesn't work that way. If you don't care about what's happening to the people, doesn't matter how good your action scene is, doesn't matter how well written that sequence is, your book's going to be boring. Action doesn't make books exciting. Danger to people you care about makes books exciting. And so if you're going to learn one thing, learning character by observing the people around you, by listening to what they say, writing down some of these things, it's dangerous to know a writer, you'll end up in the book. But just kind of paying attention to the struggles, the real everyday struggles that people have, because these are the same real everyday struggles, just different flavors of them that people have had through all time. And yeah, we have different faces on them now, and different types of challenges, but at their core, the worries and the things that frighten us are the same. And you want to write great fantasy, learn what the people around you are worried about. Learn what makes them stressed, what makes them happy, what makes them love. Focus on that, and your stories are just going to be way better than if you focus on what's the cool magic system. Now, when you've done that, do put a cool magic system in for me, because I really like those. But focus on the character first. Learn how to write good characters.
Hablabas antes de...
Earlier, we were talking about your very methodical approach to writing, but I wonder if you could give us a bit more detail, because you've talked about a horrible writer who put out novels no one wanted to publish, but I guess probably a lot of people sitting here might identify with that moment in your life and might be seeking something that probably doesn't exist, which would be the magic recipe to get published. I'm not going to ask you for that magic recipe, even though you are an expert in magic systems, but I'm not going to ask for that. But I am going to ask you for a routine beyond how many hours you spend sitting down and writing. But I don't know, your routine, your location, your state of mind. I want all the details, the whole scene. Do you have a blackboard? Do you have a whiteboard? Do you have Post-its? I want to be able to picture you writing, creating your next novel, which you can talk about later. Yes, great question.
my phone on my Dropbox, so don't steal it.
Ah, sí.
Yeah,
Lo has dejado ahí.
yeah, I'm gonna have to protect that.
Tengo que ir al baño.
You left it backstage. I've got to go to the bathroom. Sorry.
So my daily routine. I don't know how much this will be of help to people, but I am a writer. I became a writer partially for this reason. I get up at noon. I tell the kids in high schools if they're asking me, I'm like, if you want to get up at noon, become a writer. Because I set my own schedule. So I get up at noon. I'm a night owl. I learned how to write those years at a hotel working a graveyard shift, right? So I get up at noon. I generally, when I get up on time and things, I then go to the gym and I turn on epic music. And I imagine through what I'm going to do for the day. In fact, I post my my playlists on Spotify, so you can find those if you just look for the Stormlight playlist. I do one for every book. I've got one for Skyward. I've got one for Stormlight. I'm working on one for Stormlight 4 right now. And I listen to this, and I go through what I'm going to write for the day. And that's pretty important writing time for me. Going on a walk or going to the gym or being moving while I'm thinking about it. Then I go home and I write from about 1 o'clock until 5 o'clock. Then I go, shower. That's when I finally get out of my workout clothes or my pajamas for the day is at 5 o'clock. And 5:30 until 9 o'clock-ish is family time. I find that you need to remain centered. Writing is one of these things that you can very easily spend all of your time doing. It can consume you. A lot of jobs are like this, not just writing, but you can be very much eaten up by the fact that you're working from home, you're setting your own hours. You could work all of the hours. And if you do that, you're going to burn out. I need my wife and my 3 little boys to keep me grounded. My wife says that's part of her job. I come upstairs and she'll be like, all right, here's a kid with a poopy diaper. Come back to reality. And fortunately now they're all potty trained, so we don't have to do that anymore. But I then spend time with them. And it was hard early in my married life because I spent those 10 years single writing when writing could really consume almost everything. And it was some rough patches early in our marriage. Not that we've ever had really rough patches, but some of the things we had to learn was that I needed to be able to leave the books behind when it was family time. And then at about 9 o'clock, the kids go to bed. And I will generally drift back toward writing at about 10 o'clock, depending. I go back to work, and I work from about 10 until 2. And then at about 2 o'clock, I'm usually, what I've been able to do is kind of spent, and that's my video game or reading or whatever time. I can play a game, I can goof off, I can do basically whatever I want for a couple hours, and then I go to bed. And this works very well for me because it gives me 2 large chunk writing times. If I go past about 4 hours most days, my brain just starts to turn to mush. But I need, if I don't have at least like 2 or 3, that I don't really get into that zone of writing. My most productive time is usually around the hour 3, maybe hour 3 to 4, and then it starts to taper off. So I've arranged my life so I get 2 of those with a recharge in the middle of them, and that works very well for me. But all writers are different. You can't just always do, maybe that'll work for you, but I know writers who are what we call binge writers. They plan for months and don't write a thing, and then they vanish into their room and you don't see them for 6 weeks, and then they come out with a manuscript. That is a way that people write. I'm more of a slow and steady writer. Little bit each day, keep working on it, keep it in my brain so that my subconscious is kind of always noodling away on what's going to be the next thing that I need to work on.
Tamara, que sé que...
Tamara, I'm sure you have more questions. All kinds of questions in your head. Your eyes are about to pop out. I was thinking about a different type of novel outside Cosmere. I love Skyward, for instance, or Squadron, they called it in Spanish, Skyward. And I was fascinated by that description. It was a combination of the Ender's Game and also How to Train Your Dragon. I don't know. The book we expected was going to be, I was talking to friends and we were expecting it to be more young adult, but actually it really exploded. Everybody loved it. We immediately had a second edition, and I would have given it to my dad, to my brother, to anybody, because it was a really timeless story, and it really, I think, takes us all back to when you were little and wanted to write everything. So I wonder where that story came from, Skyward. Did it have anything to do with your relationship with Orson Scott Card? Because I thought about that again, about being a child again and wanting to be a fighter pilot or fly spaceships.
I mean, as a kid reading, I loved Ender's Game, like I think all of us did, right? I don't really know Scott Card. I've met him a couple times. You know him, yeah? I've met him a few times. Very nice. He wrote that very nice thing on Elantris. That was just, we sent it to him and hoped he'd read it, and he did, and then he wrote this big thing on his blog. And so, partially, definitely, it is that. Really, it goes back to my love of Boy and his Dragon stories. I mentioned Dan McCaffrey earlier, and one of my favorite books as a young man was The White Dragon, which is her third Dragon Riders of Pern book, but it's also that kind of core quintessential Boy and his Dragon story. I also love a book called Dragon's Blood by Jane Yolen. Jane Yolen's one of my favorite writers of all time. She just is amazing. And there's something that I love about that story of usually it's the kid on the outs who finds the dragon egg and is like, I'm going to protect this thing and I'm gonna catch my own dragon, right? It happened in How to Train Your Dragon, except it wasn't an egg, right? And this archetype was very fun. And one of the things I like to do as a writer is when I find something that I love, like the heist story, or like the hero's journey, or like the story of the boy and the dragon, is what do I really love about it? I actually use a metaphor that this is not just because you're here, Chakotay. I use the story of the difference between what I call a cook and what I call a chef. And I talk to my students about this. And I think it's a really important concept for writers to learn. Is my definition would be a cook. They can take a recipe and they can follow that recipe, and what they want will turn out like the recipe. But a chef is somebody different. Chef is somebody who can look at a bunch of ingredients and say, I want to make this. Here are my ingredients. How can I make this? Let me try some different things. And the big difference if you're a writer is if you're a cook, if you've only learned the hero's journey, only learned one of these archetypes, and you can follow this right along, when something goes wrong in that story, you have no idea what to do. You can't fix it. You can only kind of mimic what's been written for you. And the chef writer can say, wow, this went wrong. I'm going to look at this and drill down and find out. And a chef will look at a story and say, okay, can I separate what I love from the trappings of this story? Can I separate and find out what is it that I really love about these stories? And for me, for this story, it was a number of things. It was the person who has a goal and a dream, who really wants to fulfill it. And I thought, you know what? I know that person. I was that person, right? Even though it looks impossible, I have a dream and I want to try to fulfill it. And watching someone do that is really inspiring, and we really enjoy it as readers. What else is it? It is the person who had a chance of a lifetime that normally they wouldn't have. This is what makes the story Count of Monte Cristo work, right? It's this idea that you get this one outlandish shot that you really shouldn't have, but fate has given it to you, and you are a passionate person who has a dream. You're going to take this shot and you're going to make the most out of it. And kind of boiling down the story to those ideas and then building my own structure around it is where stories come from, I believe. The thing is, if you get good at this as a writer, you will be able to evoke the right emotions, but without the trappings. I would say that The Way of Kings is more like Ender's Game than Skyward is. Though a lot of people, because Skyward's science fiction, make that comparison. Where I used Ender's Game is for Bridge 4. And if you look at it, Ender's Game and Stormlight and something like Hoosiers, basketball movie, and things like this, they follow the same archetype of this kind of underdog sports team. Mm-hmm. And that's what Ender's Game is. That's what Bridge 4 is. And that's what this is. And if you look at it and say, well, what makes that story work? You can take it instead of an underdog sports team. You can do a war narrative about a band of people growing together against adversity and evoke those same emotions and make your story that you want to tell work in the reader's mind. And so that's what I would recommend to new writers is, boil down the things you love and try to ask yourself instead of, what were the trappings? Say, what are the emotions that made me love this? Can I take apart the pieces and put them back together? And so that's where Skyward came from, was me loving the boy in a dragon egg story and rebuilding it as something else that maybe you wouldn't notice follows some of the same beats, but is doing so because I wanted to get at those same emotions and find a way to tell a story using them.
Y después la relación, por ejemplo,
And the relationship, for example, between Skyward and Defending Elysium, because at some point you say, oh, wow, will we see a bit more of the relationship between those two stories? ¿De cuáles?
Yes, you will see a lot more in the second book of the relationship between those stories. By necessity, the first book couldn't get into much of it because it was about the main character kind of learning some of the things that were already known in Defending Elysium. The second book really digs into them quite a bit. The second book is coming out this fall, this winter, I guess. We really go into space quite a bit more. So it was a lot of fun to write. It is done and turned in. So I hope you enjoy it when it comes.
I'm totally sure.
Yo estaba revisando hace...
I was just a few days ago looking at your website and Sanderson.com, and suddenly I found in the Spanish version, I suppose it's in the English version too, that it says where to start reading Brandon Sanderson's books. And I realized that if you read fantasy, you should start here. If you're not a fantasy reader, start here. If you're young, start here. If you're older, start here. So you have recommendations for everyone. You leave nobody out. There's always a way into your work, no matter what.
I learned when I was after I'd published a book, I actually learned to pitch books after I had published books, which is the wrong way to do it. You would hope that you would learn to do pitches to editors beforehand, but I was terrible at them. Where I learned to pitch books and where I learned to kind of tailor books to people was when my first book came out, particularly once Mistborn was out, because I started asking the publisher to set up book signings for me. And when you're a brand new author, you don't get this, right? There aren't 300 people who will fight for limited ticket space to come see you. I would go to these signings and there would be no one there. Of course, why would there? But the bookstores would be like, oh, it's a book signing. Usually there's like, a handful of people there. We'll set him up in the back with some chairs. And those, I would get there and be like, no one is showing up for me. We don't need these chairs. We don't need this all set up. What I want you to do is put me at a table by the front door. And what happens is when people come in the door, I will try to sell them my book. And I felt like a little bit like a used car salesman, right? Trying to sell books to people. But during that time, I got the chance to be a bookseller. And I would stand by my little table, and I wouldn't be pushy, but if people looked at me or came over and said, oh, what's this? I'd say, oh, I write fantasy. Do you like fantasy books? And they would oftentimes say no. And I'd be like, oh, wait, why am I asking it like that? I instead want them to try reading my book no matter what. And so I developed several types of pitches where I would ask them, have you read a lot of fantasy? And they'd say, well, no. I'd be like, well, it's okay. This is for everybody. And I would pitch it a very different way. If you'd read a lot of fantasy, I would say, oh, Mistborn, it's about the story of the hero who has prophesied to save the world had failed and the Dark Lord took over. That's a pretty good pitch if you've read a bunch of fantasy, particularly during that era where Dark Lords were everywhere and young farm boys on quests were everywhere. And instead you get this book where, what if Harry Potter got to the end and Voldemort said, oh, you're a dumb kid. Of course I will beat you, and then killed him. Or even better, what if Frodo got to the end of Lord of the Rings and Sauron was like, oh, my ring. I've been looking for that. Thanks for bringing it back to me. That was a really hard, long journey. Anyway, you're dead, and I've got my ring back. you know, that pitch works very well if people like fantasy, but if they don't, they're like, I don't get it. So you had to have other pitches, and I really think fantasy as a genre. I mean, as we've seen with the explosion of fantasy media and fantasy films and superhero films and things, stuff that when I was a kid in the 80s was relegated to, you know, us geeks in the corner, everybody loves. And why is that? Because mythic storytelling is just something we love. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if it's your mom. Like the mythic storytelling, going to a brand new place and experiencing a brand new world is really exciting for us. And I think a lot more people would like fantasy if they had it pitched to them in the right way. And so instead, I would often pitch Mistborn and say, well, it's about, you know, a young woman, a young girl who lives on the streets, who has discovers she has a really special talent and is taken in by a gang of thieves and taught to imitate a noblewoman so that she can spy on them for the gang of thieves in exchange for being taught about her magical talent. So it's really My Fair Lady with magic. And you say, I want you to read My Fair Lady with magic to a lot of people who wouldn't read fantasy and like, oh, that sounds cool. You know, I would call it My Fair Assassin, right? And that's part of the book too, right? And so I try to on my website say, you know, here are different books. That fantasy is not one thing, it's many things. And even the fantasy work of one author is not one thing, it's many things. And so I like to say, you know, a phrase I use is books are like shoes, right? I think everybody wants to wear shoes. Maybe if you've always had shoes that don't fit, you'd hate shoes. But as a kid, this is what I needed to learn is that I had been given the wrong books for me, but there were books for me out there. If I just had them pitched to me in the right way, like a teacher eventually did to me with Dragon's Bane, then I would learn that, you know what, I do love books. And so I try to make sure there are lots of different ways to get into my books and different styles of books. Not all of them feel the same. This is partially another tangent, but people sometimes say to me, you know, Brandon, what I really love is Stormlight. Can't you just write only Stormlight, please? They say it a little bit sheepishly. I know some of you in the crowd have probably thought that. Or you've thought your favorite one. Usually it's either Stormlight or Mistborn. Once in a while it's Elantris or Warbreaker, where people are like, can't you just write more Warbreaker rather than working on all of this other stuff? And I try to explain to them that part of the reason I am as prolific as I am is I let myself do something different. I became a writer in part because I can't stand doing the same thing every day. I would be miserable in a lot of jobs, and I tried a bunch of these jobs where I was miserable. If you make me do the same thing every day, I am just going to go crazy. Like even as simple as something as singing in a choir. Like my church has a choir, and they tried to get me to go. And singing the same song over and over again, do you want to know misery? That's like my personal hell, right? You send me to hell and make a personal hell for me. It's just I got to do the same thing every day. The way that I relax from writing a big, difficult book like a Stormlight book is to write something different, something very different, to explore different parts of writing, different parts of my imagination and things like that. And that's why you see me kind of having writing ADHD or whatever. Like when I finish an epic fantasy, I write a young adult space opera, right? When I finish young adult space opera, I write Legion, which is detective stories about near future science fiction concepts made real. Like I am, by allowing myself to not be tied down, I make myself, I think, way, way more productive. If I were only writing one of these things, I would probably be as slow as some other people who are kind of locked into writing one thing. I wouldn't be any faster. It's just that I let myself breathe. I let myself do a lot of different things. So I'm sorry if I'm not working on your favorite right now. I will get back to your favorite. You arithmetist people, I'm sorry. Eventually I will get to that, but I do have to jump around a lot.
¿Y en qué momento de esa variación de género apareció Alcatraz?
And when did Alcatraz come up and how? Because that's really fun.
So Alcatraz came because this is where I learned. Alcatraz is what taught me I need to jump, because when I wrote Mistborn, I had this goal to write all 3 books before the first one had to be done being edited so I could make sure the continuity worked in a trilogy. And I still managed to do that. But when I wrote the first one, I immediately jumped into the second one. It's the first time in my life that I had immediately written a sequel to something I'd written. And that was really hard. And by the time I finished Well of Ascension, I was so burned out on Mistborn. Like if I would have had to write Hero of Ages, it would have been a terrible book right then because I just couldn't. I was burned out. And so my girlfriend at the time was on vacation. And so I had a lot of time. So I crawled under a table, didn't emerge, and I wrote Alcatraz as just a break from Mistborn. And it was extremely liberating to write a comedy, a middle grade comedy that was wacky and different and kind of made fun of epic fantasy. Instead of, if you guys haven't read Alcatraz, there are lots of fantasy jokes in there. At the end of the first book, the kid goes back to his dreary life, and then his grandfather shows up and is like, wait, why did you just go back to your dreary life with these people you hate? Come away to the fantasy world. That's stupid. It's just jokes like that about certain things that I do love, but end up in fantasy books. And it was my way of blowing off steam before I went to Hero of Ages. And when I wrote Hero of Ages, it was just fresh and free again. And I realized I need to have this break doing other things. And the Alcatraz series came from that. I did just, the 6th one is finished. Actually, there's one tweak I want to make to the ending. But that is the last one. You can trust me saying that. If you guys haven't read the series, Alcatraz always promised there'd be 5, and then he left it on a terrible cliffhanger as a joke to everyone. But fortunately, one of his friends in the series is writing the last book because he refuses. So it'd actually be a different character who's writing the book. But that was the joke all along that I wanted to do. So 6th book is done. That one will be coming out before too much longer. I'm slowly kind of finishing up some of these series I've left open for a while. But like I said, that's the one that taught me that I can't keep writing on the same thing or I'll get burned out.
Bueno, yo lo de Cosmier está...
Well, Cosmier, I can take on board, but Alcatraz is blowing my mind. But I guess it's understandable, and we do need to give poor Brandon a chance to break away from everything and change the pace. But, for me, fantasy and science fiction was always a sort of safe space to tell stories about the present with a bit of perspective. I'm thinking about Star Trek, but you could be thinking about many other examples. So you can get into as much trouble as you like, Brandon, but how much of the present and the current global context is there in your novels? You thought this was going to be a walk in the park? No? Sorry.
The things I see in the world are very much inform how I write. Now, let's point out, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis disagreed on one big point. They were in a writing group together, but they had a big disagreement on the nature of whether a story was meant to teach something or not. Tolkien felt you wrote a really great story that explored themes but wasn't meant to teach anyone something. And C.S. Lewis obviously thought that the power of story was in its ability to teach a lesson. And I lean more toward the Tolkien style of writing. I don't go into a book wanting to teach anyone anything. I go into a book wanting to explore the themes that the characters find interesting, that I find interesting, but I don't want to ever give answers. I want to give maybe lots of different answers to the same question, right? I quoted an idea that I first heard from Robert Jordan in not so many words, but I kind of distilled it down. You'll find Witt saying it in Stormlight, where he once answered a question along this lines that he likes when stories ask questions. And I kind of took that a step further. And to me, I think the purpose of a storyteller is to make you ask questions, to give you cool questions to think about rather than answers to those questions, or to give you two opposite answers to those questions so that you really have to think about it. But the world climate, the current world climate, there is a lot in there to digest for a fantasy writer. I think that we all wished that Gene Roddenberry was right, and that as we got further and further into the future, we would unite more and more as disparate peoples. And it feels like there's been some big steps backward over the last, say, 10 years, particularly the last like 3 or 4 years. This is really discouraging in a lot of ways. But I am an optimist. I think that for every step backward, we're going to end up taking 1.1 steps forward. And we have to not focus on the fact that there have been some backward steps, because those are inevitable. There are going to be growing pains. And also, as a writer, I think it's part of my job to try to understand people who are very different from me. And that can be kind of difficult in today's political climate. I come from a place that is very conservative, but I am not very conservative, right? And this is, in some ways, a very good thing, I think, for me, because our current political climate, the thing I hate most about it is that it seems so divided. It seems like you can't just sit down and chat about something anymore, that you have to pick sides, turn your spears against each other, and that people who think differently, I don't like this. I think the internet has enhanced this, just magnified it. And as a writer, my job is to understand other people who think differently than myself. If I can't do that, then why am I writing, right? And so my quest is always to try to get us to understand each other as best we can by having in my books people who believe different things. But when you're seeing through their eyes, you can understand why. You may not agree with them, but you can understand why. That, I think, is my mandate as a writer. If there's one thing that I want to accomplish, it is to kind of be able to explore these different things. So I hope that we will be taking some steps forward in the near future. How about that? I'll try not to get too political about it.
Pues esperaba un ninja que se iba a escaquear de todo, pero la verdad...
You've been actually quite straightforward. Good thing. And I guess we should open the floor now for questions. I'm sure everyone here has loads of questions for you, Brandon. You can raise your hand and wait for a microphone on your questions. But I would ask you, as I said before, we're all big Brandon Sanderson's fans here, but the streaming might be watched by people who might not have read his books. And so if your questions have spoilers, please try and avoid spoiling these wonderful books for people who have not read them yet. Anything else, of course, you can ask. I can see people pulling down their hands all of a sudden. What happened in book 4 of Stormlight? No. No, please, no spoilers, okay? But don't be afraid to ask questions. Go ahead. There's some people here with questions, so go ahead. There's one around here. Well, Brandon, thank you for coming, and thank you to the presenters for helping us out. And I wanted to talk about something which hasn't come up yet, which is that you normally write really long novels, but you also have story compilations, which I find the best genre of all, and it does condense your worlds amazingly in just a few pages. Is it a lot harder to write a short story than it is to write a novel? And can we expect at some point another compilation of short stories to continue expanding your world, like with Unlimited Arcanum?
Really envy people who can be really, really short. I've got a friend in my writing group, Eric James Stone, who is just a genius with the short story. And I practiced the novel a lot when I was trying to break in, because it's what I wanted to do. But after I broke in, I wanted to learn how to write shorter. I don't do short stories. I do novellas, which are short novels. And what I write feels more like a short novel rather than a long short story. But I do love that form because I do always like to be trying new things. But one of the things I found early in my career, a danger of always trying something new, is that it often made lots of promises, right? Like the break I took after writing Warbreaker was to write the book called The Rhythmatist. And, you know, my natural inclinations of a writer, when I write a book like this, are to expand. Where would it go? Build a trilogy out of it, have a cliffhanger at the ending, a little one. Not a big one, but a little one. You know, I just like to tease what would happen next, basically. And this was kind of my method of operating as a newer writer. You know, when I was trying to break in, every book kind of had this sort of, at least a tease of where the world would go. But if I started taking breaks doing that and promising big series with each one of these, it gets out of control real fast, right? And after doing this a couple of times and releasing books that then I committed to an entire series for, I realized I need to learn how to do short, and I also need to know how to do self-contained. And that is where me experimenting with the novella for things like Emperor's Soul, Shadows for Silence, Sixth of the Dusk, all of these things were like, I want to tell Cosmere stories that explore a new world in the Cosmere, but don't necessarily promise that you're going to get a whole big series about it. And I found that I really loved doing that. And so definitely you're going to get a lot more. The novella, I try to write at least one novella a year. Last year, the one I wrote was a Magic the Gathering novella, which is very different. If you don't know, my nerd obsession is Magic the Gathering. And so Wizard of the Coast came to me and said, hey, Brandon, we would like to hire you to write one of the stories in the Magic universe. And I said, no, you can't hire me because you really can't afford me. And I knew that they couldn't because I knew what they paid. But I said, you know what? I don't want to write the story that you want me to write, but I'm going to write a Magic the Gathering story. And I'm going to give it to you for free, and you can publish it, but you have to let me do whatever I want. And they said, free? Brandon Sanderson? Okay. Sure. And so I just...
¿Alguna carta pedirías a cambio de... alguna cartita que te...
And some of your missing cards, I'm sure you got at least.
I did.
Gratis no era.
It wasn't totally free.
Yeah, it wasn't totally free. But by doing stuff for free, people give you stuff. And they were like, whoa, you're going to do it for free? And then they sent me a whole bunch of stuff. So it was great. So it really was nice because they felt in my debt, right? And it was something I was basically into anyway. It was fan fiction that I wanted to write. I had a story already in mind. But that was my novella last year. The year before that was Edge Dancer, the Lift novella. This year I've started a Sixth of the Dusk sequel novella. And then there are other things that I want to do that are, you know, you'll see usually at least one a year where I need to take a break and write something different, something new. And you will see more of these things happening. So yes, it will happen. And some of these are kind of outlandish. The one I did the year before that was Snapshot, right? Which, did you guys get Snapshot in Spanish? I don't know if you did. Snapshot is a kind of
¿Alguien
grim...
se sabe si lo ha traducido? ¿Se sabe el título?
Si lo ha traducido no lo hemos visto.
No se ha traducido, vale.
Yeah.
No.
No, it's a grim serial killer police procedural, like Seven, the movie, right? So sometimes I do really different things for me, and that's very helpful as a writer to be able to explore different genres through something kind of short and sweet like that. So yeah, you'll see lots more of that in the future. And I don't do anything short, not even answer questions, so sorry.
Ahora solo quiero leer lo que haga.
And of course now I want to read this. Snapshot. I can't hear. I'm sorry.
Interpreter can translate it to
De todas formas,
Spanish.
Is it working?
Como quieras, pero si lo dices en castellano, si la gente que no lo entienda, se va a traducir igual, o sea que
Okay.
como tú quieras.
It's more of a personal message. First of all, thank you for coming, and also thank you for all your lessons online, because I have learned a lot from your YouTube in the you know what I mean, your video and stuff, and also I have learned a lot today. I'm an aspiring author as well. So all that you mentioned, all the tips, all the ideas that you have really help me and all others that want to make a living from writing. Ideally, I don't know if I will be ever as good as you are. I wish I will be, but
You can be. You absolutely can
thank
be.
you. And it's really good to learn that you suck. Like you say yourself, that you were like, nah, I wasn't that good. And I'm like, okay, because I suck as well. So I hopefully get good. So my question is, right now that you're an accomplished author, you know your way, you know your techniques, you know your voice, you have your own style. Do you feel you're still improving with every novel that you're making, or you feel like, okay, this is it, this is the highest point? Because you compare writing to playing the piano. And I know a lot of people who play the piano are really good, but they still feel that they can become even better and they can make their own melodies. Like Chicote, being the chef, can make his own meals. Like, do you still feel that there is no ceiling, so to say?
Yeah, I
Vale,
hope
no
there's
os piquéis
not.
con Brandon en intentar hacer la pregunta.
Well, like Brandon, you tend to ramble when you ask questions or answer them in this case.
Yeah, I hope, I don't get to be the judge of whether I'm getting better or not in a lot of ways, but one example of this is one of my favorite authors of all time was Terry Pratchett, right? And I've had the experience multiple times where I thought I've found the peak of Terry Pratchett's ability, and then I read another book and I'm like, oh, nope, this one is the best Terry Pratchett. And if he could keep topping himself, then I certainly hope that as a lesser writer, I can learn to top myself with each future book that I write. One of the reasons I do the novellas is to try different styles so that I can then hopefully apply them to my main books in different ways. Writing something like Shadows for Silence, which is a little more horror focused, in order to be able to then apply that to something like a Stormlight book where I need it at the right moment, is just a way for me to practice. And I hope that will help me get better with each book. But the other thing is, I have a good team. And my biggest worry as a writer is that some writers I've known through history, not people I knew personally, but writers I've read, later in their career seem to take a downturn, and it seems to correlate with them no longer getting feedback from the people around them. They basically pull a Lucas, right? Where suddenly they know what they're doing so much that they no longer have to listen or struggle. And because of that, some of the things they're doing just aren't as high a quality as what they used to do. And I don't ever want to pull a Lucas, right? And so keeping a team close to me who is willing to tell me when I need to do better is one of the ways I'm hoping to avoid that. But that is one of my big fears, is that as I get older, I will stop listening to feedback and I will start... it's really hard, right? Because you both have to listen to feedback, but also have your own vision. And you have to sometimes just ignore the feedback, because your vision for what you want to tell, that is what you wanted to tell, even if it isn't the thing that people necessarily will love. Sometimes you have to do that. But a lot of times if you're listening to feedback, it's you wanted to do something and it failed. And then you have to say, oh, I need to try again to do the thing that I wanted to do. And I hope I'll never get to the point where I'm not listening. If I do, my wife hopefully will slap me around a little bit.
El palito que le ha caído a George Lucas, así.
Well, and poor George Lucas suddenly got a bang in the head too. Never mind. Anyone else who wants to ask a question? Several people. Okay. First, thank you so much for coming. And what I wanted to ask you is whether at some point there's going to be any adaptation for film or a TV show. Would you like to be very involved in that, or would you just let them sort of get on with it? And also, I'd like to hear your opinion on what's happened with Game of Thrones.
Oh, boy.
No, ¿de verdad?
No, really? You asked that? Really? I liked it. Are we really going to open that can of worms now when we almost have to leave? Okay, Brandon, you can ignore the Game of Thrones thing, unless you want to get into it, of course. But feel free not to.
Appreciate that. I love films. I really love films. And I say films and not television because I have problems with television. When television is good, it's better than films, right? When television is really good, it can be. And but when television, particularly scripted television, is bad, you end up in this sort of loop where characters have to learn the same lesson like every couple of episodes. Drives me up the wall. Right? Particularly the network formula, which hits the reset button at the end of every season because they can't have too much progress. So I really like this kind of, we've entered an era where they're calling it the golden age of television, where a lot of the scripted television is able to tell long-form stories without having to hit the reset button. So certainly I'm excited by that happening. And so I wouldn't say no if I had the right opportunity, but I've looked mostly at film through most of my career. And early in my career, I was just happy to get the money, right? Like when you're a brand new writer, I made $5,000 the first year I published, right? The first deal was for Elantris and Mistborn. It was for $20,000, but it was across 4 years, $5,000 a year. So I made $5,000 that first year. It's not a lot of money to live on, right? This is the year that I met Emily, and she was a school teacher. And you know, she was making huge amounts of money as a school teacher compared to me. It was really hard to get by on that. So when the first option, which was for Alcatraz, came, about 2 years after that, again, I had made like $10,000 that year, and they came in and said, "Yeah, we'll pay you $35,000 a year to option this for the next 5 years." And you're like, "Yes, please, Mr. Katzenberg. Thank you. Hand me that small bag of money, and I can live on that." And as I got more popular, that bag of money got bigger that they would hand me, right? When they would come and say, "Hey, these books sell well. Large bag of money," right? Well, I've hit a stage in my career where a large bag of money is no longer needed as much to live on as it once was. And so I've started to be able to say no. I don't want your large bag of money, which Hollywood does not know what to do when you say no to a large bag of money. That's like the only thing they have. They're like, "Really? Is it not large enough?" And you're like, "No, that's not it at all. I don't want your large bag of money. I want a good film." And they're like, "Oh, we don't know how to make those." Right? No, really. There are directors who know how to make good films. And there are lots of screenwriters who know how to write great films. And there are lots of cinematographers who know how to make genius films. But Hollywood as a whole doesn't seem to know how to make films. It just happens to them accidentally when they get the right people together. And so I've started to be able to say, bring me one of these directors that knows how to make good films, Hollywood, and then we'll talk. And the bag of money size is irrelevant. And I've started to get to the point where I can do that, and hope to have some good announcements in the future. You know, Pat has been able to do this, Pat Rothfuss with his books. And we're starting to get to a point where fantasy is popular enough, and a lot of people are doing adaptations of fantasy, that they're willing to listen when you say that. So in an ideal world, I'd like to be very involved. I'm not a screenwriter. I do not want to write the screenplay. And I say that to them straight out, because that's a little bit like a basketball player deciding to suddenly play baseball, right? Which would never happen. No one would ever be that foolish to assume. But, you know, I could probably write an okay screenplay. I could do minor leagues version of a screenplay. But if I want to get a great film, I need a great screenplay. And so I want to work with great screenwriters. I want to be in the room when they're talking about what to do and how to adapt it. But I want a great screenwriter to write a great screenplay. We have a really good one for Snapshot, for example. And so I want to be very involved. But I want to be very involved in I'm part of a team. I'm not the diva author saying you can't do this, you can't do that. But I want to be in the room. And my newer contracts are all requiring them to let me be in the room whenever they're doing discussions about story. And so hopefully this will get us further. In some ways, we're kind of lucky in that when I needed the bags of money, the movies never got made, and so they just gave me the bags of money to not make movies, which, you know, is really kind of nice if you think about it. And now that I don't care about the bags of money, hopefully I can actually get something good made. So we'll see.
¿Ha visto? Nos ha querido meter en...
See, he avoided the Game of Thrones part. Next question. Someone over there? Sorry. Hi, good evening. I have a question. Which of all your books is your favorite? Which one you enjoyed writing the most and why? And what is your favorite, not yours, novel out there? Okay, so easy question. Out of the whole history of literature, one favorite book and your own favorite. Obviously, he's got a busy summer and he just wants to read one book, or two maybe.
Entre mis obras no tengo un preferido, no tengo una favorita. Si me preguntas cuál es mi favorita, no es lo mismo que si me preguntas con cuál me lo pasé mejor escribiéndola. Son cosas muy distintas. Como novelista, muchas veces tienes los libros te suscitan emociones diferentes. Y me gusta cada una de mis obras por distintos motivos. No podría elegir un preferido. Los que más me divierto suelen ser los rápidos. Alcatraz, Escuadrón, es un solo punto de vista, la escribes del tirón y está muy bien, pero los de Archivos de las Tormentas son muy difíciles. ¿Quiere eso decir que no son mis favoritos? Pues mira, la sensación de satisfacción cuando los acabo es increíble. Pero no es divertido escribirlos. O no es igual de divertido que los otros ejemplos que os daba, y a pesar de eso son satisfactorios. Cada libro es como cada uno de mis hijos. Cada uno de mis hijos tiene algo chulísimo y tiene cosas que hacen que me subo por las paredes. Lo mismo me ocurre con las novelas. Si tuviera que quedarme con una sola novela que no es mía, si tuviera que escoger solo un título, seguramente diría The Truth, la verdad, de Terry Pratchett. Fue lo que hizo que me enganchara a Pratchett. Había leído un par antes, pero este fue el primero que hizo que flipara. Si tenemos que hablar...
Los Miserables.
Si tenemos que hablar en clásico, serían Los Miserables. Y vencer al dragón, pues siempre tendrá un rinconcito de mi corazón por ser la que hizo que me enganchara a la fantasía.
Más creo.
Les Miserables is probably too long for a summer, so your summer, so probably not. Okay, and we have to wrap it up because we don't have a lot more time.
Por favor, te pido.
Tengo un vuelo a las 10.
Okay, so one last one, and please be brief because he's got to catch a flight and he's got to read Les Miserables over there. So, well, thank you very much for coming. It is a short question. In a lot of your books, you speak about beliefs and religion, and I wonder how much of what you say is based on your own experience, or how much do you try and stand away from your own perspective?
It's an excellent question. Every character I write has something very similar to how I feel and something very different from how I feel. And every character has to be a mixture of those explorations. When I look at the religious feelings of the different characters, sometimes the character will feel somewhat like I do. Most of the time it's not a one-to-one analog because I don't think anyone's faith is the same as anyone else's. I've heard it said that there's many different ways to be. For instance, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There's as many different ways to be LDS as there are people who are LDS. There's many different ways to be Catholic as there are Catholics in the world, right? But a lot of characters are me exploring the way that people believe that is different from me, because I find that fascinating. And as I've always said, books are about me exploring the world, and trying very hard to not undermine the beliefs of the characters who believe differently from me. Nothing bugs me more than going into a book and finding the person who's like me, but then finding they only exist in the book to be taught how wrong they are, right? Like it's okay for people to change in books and to realize they were wrong, but I don't want characters' only purpose be to prove how wrong that character is. And so I try to treat every belief or lack of belief that I approach in my books with as much respect as possible. I want the person who believes somewhat similar to that person or who has a worldview similar to that person reading the book to say, yeah, you got it right, Sanderson. That is the right way to do it. You've expressed the way I believe the best. And that's really important to me because I don't think we get answers. I don't think we arrive at those answers through presenting poor arguments for the other side. I think that when both sides' arguments are strong, that is what leads us toward truth, right? We arrive at truth by people who believe strongly and who make good arguments, making those good arguments to each other, and making the both people have to say, I didn't think about it that way. We arrive at truth when someone else changes our mind. That is the way we approach things. And so that's how I try to approach my writing, is characters expressing real ideas as best as I can express the ideas that I've gotten from other people, that I've read about from other people, that I've explored from other people's viewpoints, and put those into my books so that the characters are not arriving at a truth, but they're certainly all inching closer by the way that they interact with one another.
Tamara, una frase para despedirte de Brandon.
Tamara, final words to say goodbye to Brandon who's got to leave. But just thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope to see you back again soon, perhaps in a new Celsius edition. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Alberto? Well, I never thought that day when I was told, you've never read Brandon Sanderson, I would end up one day chatting with him here in the Telefónica Foundation. It's been such a pleasure. As Tamara said, we hope that it won't be the last time we get a chance to talk to you. You're welcome here always. And, well, every word you've shared and everything that you write really means a lot to us. So thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for your books and your words and being here today. Thank you for everything.
Aquí, gracias a los de Éter, gracias al Espacio Fundación Telefónica.
Te escribo
And,
cuando pase esto.
The Telefónica Foundation and Brandon Sanderson.